I'm David Pinsof.
And I think I'm David Pietraszewski,
Welcome to Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast.
where you will hear actual evolutionary psychology being done by actual evolutionary psychologists. David, good to see you.
Good to see you too, Dave. I'm really excited about this guest. This was an amazing conversation. Uh,
Yeah, we have Sheina Lew-Levy, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Durham University in the UK.
and she's done absolutely mind-blowing work. She has done anthropological field work in a small group of foragers in the Congo Basin, studying the evolution of childhood learning and childhood itself and child development in a culture that is quite distant from ours, with child rearing practices that are quite different from ours. So if you're a parent, I think this will be particularly interesting for you. I know I confronted Sheena with three Darwinian mysteries that arose in my own experiences being a dad, and I thought she absolutely fully solved them. She addressed them to my satisfaction right on the spot. It was really impressive.
So sit back, relax, and take a nap. Well, don't take a nap because, well, if you're a parent, you might need a nap, but don't take a nap because you won't listen to what we're saying. So relax and listen.
Enjoy.
So Sheena Lew-Levy is joining us today. Sheena, really good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You are the first human behavioral ecologist that we have had on.
That's fun.
And one of the things that we were excited to do with this thing we're doing is explain to people what the evolutionary social sciences are and who the people are doing it. And because you happen to be the first human behavioral ecologist on, um, well, number one, the question is, do you think of yourself that way?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of many of the that we've only had two people on so far, and both have been psychologists, like lab psychologists, but they've still sort of talked about their journey to discovering at least an evolutionary approach to psychology, for
Yeah.
example. So yeah, the one question is like, do you consider yourself a human behavioral ecologist? And then related to that is like I think a natural maybe question, and I don't know this about you, is how you got into it.
Oh God, that's a real story. Okay,
Okay.
first I'll say I think I would say a big part of my training is human behavioral ecology, but when you study kids, you just need to do a little bit of everything because they just defy disciplinary categorization. So yeah, definitely a big portion of my training is in human behavioral ecology. My PhD is actually in psychology, which not a lot of people
Mm.
know.
Oh,
But yeah, I ended up there because I just found the right advisor for me, and I to this day have never taken a psychology class, even though I teach psychology now. So, so my training is definitely more in evolutionary anthropology than psychology. And then how I got into this, oh, I'm going to take you guys on a journey.
Oh,
It's
that's
not
great. Journeys are great. We
yes,
both
yeah,
did. We literally spent an entire episode talking about how each of us discovered an evolutionary approach to
yeah.
psychology in particular.
Yeah, we got deep into it. Dave got all the way back to his childhood,
Yeah.
so I think go as deep
okay.
as you want.
Okay, so I'm going to take you back to my adolescence. So, as like an older teenager, kind of emerging adult, I was very into bushcraft, like
Mm.
what we call first skills, right? And so I spent actually 2 years at a survival school in Washington State, um, tanning hides and foraging. And this school also had an element, like a homeschool or unschooling kind of kids nature program. And so we would learn to mentor people, and they would always tell us like hunter gatherers learn like this, hunter gatherers do that. And I was like, okay, where's the actual research? So I started off in cultural anthropology after that, and I found a really great mentor there, but it wasn't quite a right fit in terms of content. Like I learned so much, and I was super passionate about it, but there was always something missing. And I was scrolling on Facebook during an undergrad class, and on a homeschooling blog, they posted about this book called Hunter-Gatherer Childhoods, edited by Barry Hewlett and Michael Lamb. And I was like, this is it. Like, this is what I want to do.
Mm.
So I just went through the list of all the contributors in the book and emailed a bunch of people and ended up at Cambridge to work with Frank Marlowe. And he unfortunately retired right as I was starting for my master's. So I had to find another supervisor who ended up being the editor of the book, the only other person there, Michael Lamb. So that's kind of how I got into this stuff. And my best friend Luke and I, we spent like a few months of our lives like on these logging roads in Washington State, like trying to make it. And we were so hungry and so incompetent and so bad at everything. And like we would always fantasize about like other camps being along the different logging roads where we could just drop by for some food. And for me, it was like really foundational like lessons in like really three things in cultural evolution that we talk about. Like the first is like it takes a long ass time to learn to be a good hunter-gatherer. Like you're
Yeah.
not going to do it in 2 years.
Yeah.
The second thing is you need a lot of cooperation. And the third thing, which I think we talk about less, but we were on these like super monocrop logging forests, right? That just had no ecological diversity. But traditionally, a lot of the communities, indigenous communities of that region would be really tending the environment to produce food. So in terms of niche construction, like that's the other thing, like tending your environment to your needs is the third thing that we really learned on that
Well,
trip.
so what is niche construction? Just for
Yeah, so
those who
niche.
don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, so like a beaver is the kind of quintessential example of niche construction, right?
Hmm.
Like you dam a river and you make a pond and you live in the pond. And humans
Hmm.
do that all the time, right? We curate our environment to fit our needs. So we make
Hmm.
clothes. That's an example of niche, which means that we don't need to be furry in cold environments. But we
Hmm.
also curate the foragers that I work with in the Congo Basin, for example, they'll replant parts of wild tubers to regenerate that growth, and they know where those areas are and they can come back to it. So the way in which we curate our environment to produce food and other resources that we need is really central to what it means to be a successful hunter-gatherer. And 10 years now that I've been actually doing, or 9 years that I've been doing field work with actual hunter-gatherers, and I'm still so bad at all of it, even though I try, like 4-year-olds surpass me in there. I've taken whole ass university botany courses, and a 4-year-old, I'm like, is this the food one? And she's like, nope. So
Like with an eye roll. Yeah. Like,
yeah, with a little eye roll, like, come on, girl, you're an adult. Get
yeah.
this together.
I
Amazing.
mean,
So yeah, no, David, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, what you're describing challenges sort of this pop evolutionary psychology notion that our ancestors were dumb cavemen hitting each other with clubs, and that to take an evolutionary approach to human behavior is to figure out how we are dumb cavemen or monkeys deep down, and how that is driving us insane in the modern world. And part of the goal of this podcast is to move beyond that
Yeah,
popular understanding to
yeah,
recognize that actually making a living as a hunter-gatherer in the wilderness is extremely difficult and cognitively demanding. And our ancestors were not dumb cavemen. They were sophisticated herbalists, horticulturalists, tool makers, political strategists,
for
you
sure.
name it. And
Yeah,
so once we take a proper understanding of the complexity and the cognitive demands of the human evolutionary niche, the design of the human mind becomes much uh, uh, clearer, or we have a better sense of what kinds of cognitive equipment we're dealing with, and why we possess those cognitive tools.
sure. Yeah,
Um,
I think I'll add to that, but first I'll caveat that I work with contemporary hunter-gatherers. So I can kind of generalize from there about but they live in modern environments. Every night in the village where I work, which has no electricity, they spend all day charging these enormous speakers and we dance all night, like
Mm.
grandmas all the way through 4-year-olds just parties. So it's like obviously they're contemporary people, but a lot of the activities that they do can tell us a lot about, when we take into account whatever changes and technology can tell us some things about the past. Um, but that said, we have many, many years of being anatomically modern humans, and so we can tell a lot about the past by knowing about this very kind of long-ranging subsistence strategy. I always say the people are modern people, but the subsistence strategy is our defining subsistence strategy. And by studying it, we can learn a lot, like you say. And it is a fact that it's really hard to make a living. And then the other thing too is like there's this I have a very close colleague and friend, Anamika Milk. She's an archaeologist, and we've worked together on some experimental archaeology with hunter-gatherers because this is another fallacy. So
Mm.
archaeologists, when they do experiments with spear throwing and stuff, they get undergrads at university with absolutely no background, and they're like, throw these spears in the quad, and then they're really bad at it. And they're like, spears are not efficient. And so we've done these. She started off doing spear throwing experiments with javelin athletes and was able to show that they throw really, really far, but they're not very accurate because they don't need to in their craft. And then we did it with the community that I work with in the Congo Basin that hunt with spears. And because it's a rainforest, they don't shoot from very far, but they're incredibly accurate from where they're comfortable. And in her work, she always says, like, the more simple the technology, the harder it is to use because you have to be closer, you have to be stronger, you have to be like with a bow and arrow, you can be pretty far, right? But if you're stalking an animal with a spear, you have to be so quiet, so aware of all the elements and everything. So the more complex the technology is to make, the easier it is to use, and vice versa. So probably early spear hunters, right, which is predates bow hunting, for example, would have been just as, if not more, cognitively complex in terms of what they were able to do than folks who came after that.
Yeah, I mean, just thinking about being alone in the wilderness with a spear trying to hunt and kill my
Yeah,
dinner.
yeah.
Uh, that doesn't sound easy. I mean, you have to build the spear first. You have to find, the right materials, the right kind
Mhm.
of wood, the right kind of spear tip. You have to fashion, you have to have the right size, the right length. You have to understand the logic of aerodynamics and what distance, how far away you should be. Uh, uh, you know, all this complicated stuff. It doesn't
Yeah.
sound like a walk in the park by any
Yeah, and you
stretch
have
of the
to
imagination.
coordinate because it's a team sport. I
Hmm.
love like I took this like business class during my master's. It was like such a random thing. It was about women in business. What was I doing there is a mystery. And the guy started off by being like, we need to take into account our evolutionary roots. Men are solo hunters and women cooperate together. And I was like, I'm out of here. Like
Yeah.
it's so incorrect because so much of hunting is actually a cooperative activity.
Right.
And if anything, more so than forward than like the traditional, if we can talk about whether those gender divisions of labor are kind of realistic in the imaginary one. But if we just think about foraging in terms of plant food, it's a lot more individualistic than hunting is.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
you're all, oh yeah, go ahead, David. Yeah.
I mean, I was just gonna add to that. I mean, beyond the challenges of hunting the animal when the animal is in your sights, there is the added, arguably more difficult challenge of finding the animal in the first place.
Yeah.
And that itself requires a whole lot of cognitive skills of being able to know the seasonal mating patterns and the distribution of the local flora and fauna,
Hmm.
where different plants grow, where different animals congregate, being able to track an animal by its footprints, or by the stuff it leaves behind or the marks it makes on trees. Like this is incredibly complicated detective work, and
Hmm.
so our brains were really quite useful for us.
Hmm.
They're not just this this
Yeah.
useless
Heat
Yeah.
dispersion.
atom. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's a lot of work to power a brain, I think, and there's a reason for that. Yeah.
So you're on this Jeep road, and this is before you were interested in anthropology, is that right?
So, well, I wouldn't say before because my dad is
Okay.
also an anthropologist.
Oh,
So I really
fantastic.
tried to get away and I was like, oh,
Uh,
I'm gonna be a lawyer. Like I'm gonna subvert my parents and become a lawyer. And for my best efforts, I was kind of led back. I would say like even as a young kid, like whenever we traveled or when I like had problems with my friends, like my parents would always say, well, just like take a step back and like approach it like an anthropologist. And so
mm.
that was like very much a lens that I grew up with. And my dad, bless his soul, like he's 80 now. He's still writing papers. He's like, I'm finally retired. I can focus on research. Uh, and even now, like the way that we were watching, have you guys watched Love is Blind on Netflix?
Mhm.
It's
No.
it's
It's a
bad television. I recommend
great.
it. And
Yep.
he was visiting us and he like got really into it, watched it with us, and he was like, I want to write a paper comparing all the different like romantic norms because now there's like Love is Blind Japan, Love is Blind Sweden, Love is Blind Germany, and he got like super psyched. So I think there's always been that bit of it. My dad did field work for his PhD, but didn't love field work. And I think that's where
Mm.
we really defer because I love the communities that I work with. I love being in the field. I have learned so much and like when you just like make great friends, like that's how it feels in the village where I work. So that's really a motivator for me to keep going at this point. Yeah.
When you, I mean, when we can start talking about some of the content maybe of what you study. One of the things we talked about in the past episodes, and I think one of the themes so far has been that science in general and an evolutionary approach, and then especially I think, and you can tell me if you agree with this, anthropology, and then even within that, studying children, which is actually something I do as a psychologist, or even studying adaptations or just the way people work. It's very much that you are um, taking you're quieting down and you're sort of listening to groups of people who are not being listened to by others, right? It's sort
Mm,
of there a common theme I think has been that in the noise and bustle, especially of the modern world,
mm,
that there's sort of one of the themes of the people we've talked to, and I think even David and myself, is that there's at some point a realization that like things are complicated, we don't understand them, and in order to understand things, we have to ask
yeah.
parts of life that haven't been listened to. And for
Yeah.
example, I mean, kids are a great example of that. A non weird society is a great example of that. Um, and so, I wonder, is when you talked about your dad sort of said approach things like as an anthropologist, there's a lot of ways to take that
Mm.
statement. And I'm just wondering, is that number one, what does being an anthropologist mean to you? And then number two, does this idea of respecting things that might be overlooked by most people, is that something that sort of resonates with you, or does that sound familiar?
Yeah. I mean, for sure. And the shocking thing is, like, a lot of things that are overlooked are so easily remedied. Like, even in the West, like, I have a friend and colleague, Yvonne Krupin. He got his PhD at Harvard doing kind of classic child development. He was like, finished his PhD, started doing cross-cultural work. And he was like, I don't know anything about kids. Like, I spent my entire PhD testing kids and I never talked to any. And it's
Yeah.
so easy to remedy, right? And actually talk to kids about why they make the choices they're doing in experiments, talk to people about why they parent the way they do, why they act the way they do. Like people love to tell you about themselves in any culture around the world. They love explaining things. So it's like such an easy fix. Um, and I think like in the be an anthropologist thing, I will say like as somebody who's like very socially anxious and like very worried about breaking norms, when you go into a culture that you're not familiar with, it's just like you're gonna fuck up. Like, and then you
Yes.
just let go,
Hmm.
and then people correcting you and telling you you're doing something wrong is actually part of the research. So unless you violate a norm, you're never going to realize that that norm exists because it's implicit. And it takes people correcting you and saying, no, like I remember one of my first, so the first time I was alone in the field, I went to follow this family into a forest camp and I brought a tiny bit of salt and some like magic cubes to share. And this person who now is my very close friend, this woman came up to me and she was like, "You're not sharing right." And like basically told me like you didn't bring enough stuff to share with everybody. You can't just share with one person, like like laid out all these sharing norms for me,
Mm.
right? And like when you just don't know anything and you're completely novice or novel in a social environment, you just have to be okay with violating norms. And in a way, it's a sense of freedom, right? Than like, I'm tipping 20%. Should have tipped 22? I can't remember. Like if it's this venue or this setting where you realize that you're having an effect on that and then having that feedback very directly because everybody agrees that you're bad at something rather than you're an asshole is really freeing. So I think that's been like a really useful lesson of anthropology for me. Um, and then the other bit that we get to do as human behavioral ecologists is the quantitative bit. So we're
Mm.
not only talking to people,
Yeah,
we're
that's
also
right.
following them around and taking notes about what they're doing. So that's a lot of fun too.
Yeah.
I think you get the kind of depth and breadth when you take both approaches.
Yeah, that's right. Historically, I mean, I have a cartoonish, probably, very much probably, view of the history of anthropology, even though I sort of have a foot in it, which is sort of there had long time been just sort of the ethnography thing, which is just sort of you go and it was sort of, largely colonial sort of, but it was sort of, somebody going to this strange place and writing a book about their experiences. And even as my undergrad experience, like this was a lot of what I was reading ethnographies. I loved it, Colin
Yeah.
Turnbull, the Mbuti, things
Yeah.
like that, the forest people, things like that. Um, the the history of sort of adding the quantitative part, do you have do you have thoughts on sort of what your representation of that is or
Yeah, I mean, I think in the really early ethnographies, there was quantitative work involved
Mm,
in it. People were taking, kinship diagrams is a social network, right?
right.
Um, Even the Kula Ring, Malinowski's work on trade, right? Margaret Mead was doing IQ tests with kids and showing that they weren't taking the straight path, they were taking the most beautiful path because that's where all the, like challenging intelligence tests. So some of the earliest work I think did include quantitative work. And that was when anthropology was a little bit more ingrained within more of the social or biological sciences. And then as there was a divergence between more of the humanities track and the quantitative track, evolutionary and cultural anthropologists kind of separated. And then we got more of that distinction. And I think there's good reason for that, right? Counting people does violence in a way, and we need to contend with that in our field. You reduce people to numbers.
Yeah.
Um, you draw out their boundaries, which could be wrong. And then, those are still used in Canada. Those are used in court cases around Indigenous land cases. So there's a lot of kind of tricky things in terms of the ethics of counting. But then at the same time, like I always come back, I work with a lot of social anthropologists, and we often like, for example, I did a study on play and work and I was quantifying this, and a social anthropologist was like, you can't separate them, like they're part of the same. And I was like, I know, it's just a model. It's not real. I'm not saying this is how the community conceives of it. I'm saying we have to make a boundary somewhere if we're going to look at the trade-off in these activities. And I think that's where we have to make concessions we have to be critical of our work, which I think evolutionary anthropologists aren't in writing. I think we're very critical. There are exceptions, but I think we are more willing. Let me back up. So I think we come from a scientific tradition in writing, which means that when we talk about theory, we talk about something that exists in the world. But when you actually talk to most evolutionary anthropologists, their theory is like very shaped by the community that they work with, right? So like Brooke Shells's work, for example, on this kinship category that is, I'm gonna butcher it, but it's on, and she would be a great person for you guys to
Right.
have on your podcast too, but
Mhm.
on like extramarital um children of the Himba,
Yeah.
so the husband has a specific kin term for that child, which means child, but has a different, like it's a different word. And
Hmm.
that led to a lot of her research on, these extramarital relationships amongst the Himba. Thinking of Jeremy Coster's work on hunting and food preferences and how amongst the Mayagna in Nicaragua, their hunting preferences don't match the expectations we would have for optimal foraging people because culture and people have food preferences and some food tastes good and other meat doesn't, right?
Yeah.
So things like that. And you realize like, oh, we're all talking about it at conferences and in our presentations, but when you start writing like a scientist, then you have a background with theory and then a method section, and you don't it's harder to report that kind of iterative nature of the development of these theories. And I think that's something we could probably work on. in terms of improving even just our storytelling. Scientific articles are so boring. They're
Yeah.
boring to write, they're boring to read,
Yeah.
they're behind a paywall, so nobody reads them anyways. And we could do a lot better storytelling through podcasts like this, but also through just more narrative writing about our science.
Yeah. And I think like every anthropologist I talk to, and I try to talk to them as much as possible. Like John Patton, who was a uh, dear person I talked to who passed away recently. Every HBS, I study group conflict, and I feel like every time I got to talk to John Patton, it was like I was like a kid in a candy store, where it was keeping me honest because I'm just like
Yeah,
some dumb psychologist, in the lab and talking to John. He's like, no, this is what it's like in a small scale social war where everybody knows everyone else, and this is what female leadership looks like, and nobody even knows about it unless you know the
right.
field site for 30 or 40 years. So yeah,
Yeah,
no, I really like anthropology is so important to the evolutionary behavioral sciences and really, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later. But one of the trends that I've talked to many, especially evolutionary psychologists about, is that the separation between sort of evolutionary psychology and evolutionary anthropology in terms of like conferences and things, and some of it's practical, like just summer field work and things, but there's a concern of that being separate, more separation. And I think really anthropologists really keep us, meaning like the psychologists, honest. And I really don't want to be in an evolutionary behavioral sciences where there's no anthropology talking to psychologists.
right. You don't want it to all be like mating stuff, college mating studies.
Even that, I mean, even and it's a similar thing to like
Yeah.
what you described in your class, the management class, where I went to a psychology department, and I was in a psychology department for a while where there was no interaction with the anthropology department. Here at
Mm,
UCSB, as an
yeah.
undergrad or as a grad student, I took classes with Mike Gervin. The
Mm,
CP is in the anthropology department. It was, if
right.
you look at the faculty, it's like anthro psych. I mean,
Yeah,
just down the line.
that's awesome.
And then I went to a psychology department where there was no interaction with psychologists and or a psychology department, no anthropologists, excuse me. And people would just say things and I'd be like, no, there's like this society that does this. I became like the anthropologist in the room for my, my the novice one, but at least the
Mm.
amateur, like, so I was really struck with how important it is to have this like broad cultural ecological perspective for psychological claims and evolutionary psychology and psychologists especially, I think, really are not kept in check without having talking to folks like you, for example.
And I think also vice versa. I mean, experiments can really help deepen your understanding of a community, especially when you talk to people during the experiment.
Mm.
So like for example, this summer, I always say I only do experiments to prove them wrong. And this summer we were doing an imitation experiment because we have this idea that we have age-based imitation biases. So kids prefer to learn from adults, presumably because adults have like survived until adulthood and they probably know more, right? And a lot of my work has shown that kids spend a lot of time learning from other kids. So we're like, let's do an experiment and see in these communities where there's a lot of peer imitation or sorry, peer learning, whether we're able to instigate this in this community. And so I'm doing this experiment with this little girl. And first, we're showing them pictures of a peer and an adult that they don't know from a different village far away. And we're like, who do you want to learn from? And she's just like, skip, skip. And then finally she like looks at me. She must have been like 6 or 7, super frustrated. She's like, I can't pick because I don't know these people. And it's
Mm.
like, oh, like of course, like in a small scale society where you know every single person there, you're not using age heuristics. Those are meaningless. You're using your detailed knowledge of what people can do like in a much more straightforward way. And it was like, okay, that's gonna go in the paper, I think.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
awesome.
that's so fascinating. I mean, the idea, I mean, that our entire society is structured around learning from strangers, that we don't know
Yeah.
our teachers,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is an incredibly alien way of learning,
Yeah.
which is kind of frightening
Absolutely.
when you think about it, just how weird and alien our entire education system is in terms of the design of the human mind. That
Mhm.
we are sitting down in chairs, passively receiving information from an adult stranger who doesn't really have our best interests at heart. at the end of the day and is just being paid to be there
Yeah.
and to teach us stuff. And it's kind of shocking that there uh, isn't as much integration between anthropological research on children's learning and our actual education system. You would think that this would be vital information for designing educational systems that jive with the human mind and with the natural way in which we learn things, and yet they're completely disconnected. I know of no person in education who is familiar with this kind of anthropological research. So, what do you think are the implications of your work for education, given that you know so much about the ways in which children learn? How are those ways different from how they learn in Western societies?
Yeah, I'll tell you first about what I thought before my kids started doing phonics, and then I'll tell you what I
Yeah,
think
cool.
now. So, I mean, what we know from the research in many, many small scale communities, including migrant communities to the US who, come from indigenous backgrounds but are living in like Los Angeles, right? Um, we know that they're much better able to attend to more stimuli at the same time than one thing at a time. So they're paying attention to many, many individuals doing things rather than
Hmm.
focusing on one person at a time.
Hmm.
There's an emphasis on doing things together rather than, well, I'm the adult, here's some like kind of disarticulated tasks. Trust me, they lead to something meaningful, right?
Yeah.
Um, and the goal is not learning. The learning is peripheral to the goal of doing something together. And that's a really different perspective on learning, right?
Hmm.
I think it's important to think back to the history of formal education, which really is about two things. And I might get a little bit political here. But one is about, well, what do we do when there's child labor laws and everybody's got to be in the factory and the kids are in the streets? Like, we got to put them in school.
Yeah.
And number two, how do we make future workers?
Yeah.
And those are valid kind of every education system, formal or informal, is about how do you make kind of individuals who are able to do things that they need to do in their society, right? And
Hmm.
that I think a lot of our education system reflects those things. The problem is that we have path dependencies in our institutions, and we don't seem to be able to adapt to the fact that that's not really true anymore. And probably most people aren't working in factories, and probably they could learn to work in factories pretty straightforwardly. So then how do we um, support the kind of creative learning that and more independent learning that happens in a lot of these places, in the majority world. There's some cool initiatives. So there's like schools like uh, democratic schools that David Lancy writes a lot about, and David Gray as well. A lot of Davids coming up in this talk, guys.
Yeah. I know it becomes confusing. Yeah.
Wow.
And that's a lot more about collective decision making, where the kids are saying to these teachers that are roaming about, okay, we want to work on a project on this topic, and can you support us in learning about this topic? So a lot more student-led learning. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be somebody that you know that's teaching you, but there is a lot of research, not mine, but a lot of interesting research that suggests that socio communicative norms, if they're not in line with your teachers, you're just going to have a harder time learning. And this has a lot of implications, especially for minority kids who come from different cultural backgrounds. There's some great examples in anthropology of norms about eye contact. So we think of eye contact as polite. And in some indigenous societies, making eye contact is considered really rude. And so when you have, a majority, like probably European descent teacher working with an indigenous kid, and she's like, this kid is so rude, he's not
Mhm.
making eye contact with me, then you have this mismatch of norms in the classroom that can really hinder learning. So even just an awareness of that, not in a superficial way, but in getting to know students and getting to know the different ways they communicate, I think is something that would be really cool to do. There are more and more kind of teacher researcher initiatives, where teachers are being trained to do anthropological work in their students' households. And one great example of this is called the Funds of Knowledge approach, which was done, I think it was in Arizona, where there's a lot of Mexican migrants. And they trained these teachers in anthropological methods, sent them out into these households. And then the teachers are like, oh, like these families know things. Like we're not starting at zero. We're starting from all the knowledge that they have in terms of their social networks, in terms of like their business acumen, like kids are participating in all this commerce. Like let's build our lessons around that. And it's such an amazing refreshing way. And I think if a big problem is that we don't, at least in the UK, there's so much pressure on meeting these milestones for teachers that there's not really the time for them to be creative in their approach to education. Um, and that's what it would really need. Like a big, there's the need that justifies innovation, but there's also having time, which I think is probably more the human approach, right? The more time you have, the more creative you have, you can make mistakes, you have that protected time. And it would be, I think that's the bit where we could really make some progress. Okay, but then that said, so now that my kid is learning to read, I think one thing that I've learned is there are some skills where you need dedicated teachers who are really specialized at teaching things. And I have wondered now whether our kind of pivot in the post-industrialized West towards so much teacher-led teaching has a lot to do with literacy and kind of disembodied math, like, right, just like
Mm,
numbers that
Hmm.
aren't related to actual things.
yeah.
And that you kind of need to get over that hurdle with very direct active teaching in that setting before, and then that leads to kind of these recursive loops where then once you're able to read and you've been exposed to that type of education, then you just reproduce that and over with your family and you get kind of runaway cultural evolution in that type of teaching style. I don't know, but it's been, rattling around in my head.
Yeah. So the idea to make sure I understand, the idea is that it might be sort of an all of the above approach in that there are some cases where that direct disembodied math or that just mapping phonemes to weird squiggles on the page,
Yeah,
that's just, sorry, for a little while we're just going to do
exactly.
regular
Yeah.
regular teaching. Somebody's going to stand up and talk to you and tell you what to do and you're going to like it. But of course then the thing where we have like collective autonomy, creativity, that also needs to be nourished too, and it's all the above sort of thing.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of parts of our lives that we could probably do better. Like there's no kids in the street. I don't know if you guys have noticed, like there's no kids about. When you go to any country anywhere else in a majority of the world, there's like children out and about doing things. Even you go to Spain,
Yeah,
you
Germany. I was just living in Germany the past 9 years. I mean, actually, I mean, selfishly, one of the reasons we wanted to invite you so soon was because, I spent my existence in Germany was like great playgrounds, seeing
yeah,
kids having autonomy in
yeah,
Germany, and then
yeah,
coming back to the U.S. And the playgrounds in the U.S. are sort of like I'm doing a pat on the head, like nonverbal. Like it was
yeah.
clearly designed by somebody, and this is like almost all playgrounds. They're getting a little bit better, and there is a movement to create what are called innovative playgrounds, where
Mm,
basically it's the you just ask the question, is this look fun to you as an adult? Like, is this somewhere that would be pleasant or interesting? Or is it
right.
basically like a bunch of stairs, you know?
Yeah,
And it like playgrounds in Europe and especially Germany, I didn't realize this, but playgrounds were started in Berlin. Playgrounds in Berlin are amazing. And it was a huge part of our life. My son having autonomy, walking around, kids walking around, kids are just everywhere. And the
yeah,
social structure is built to like think about kids and then coming back to the US and I'm like, wow, not at all, and
yeah,
so I really feel this that
yeah.
and maybe the UK is similar to the US in this respect, maybe.
It's a bit in the middle. So just like for listeners, like in Germany, because we were in Leipzig, and in
Yeah.
Germany, it's like I can only describe as like a World War II bomb site turned into a playground. Like I don't know if that was yours, like a lot of jagged edges and
Mm,
like
Yes.
20-foot high slide,
YouTube
right?
playgrounds in Germany and you'll see. Yeah, yeah,
It's like the definition of risky play. And then
yeah.
here it's like the kind of foamy grounds, like
Yes.
no kids are getting hurt, but it's also a little bit less fun at the same time. And yet there's just not a lot of place to involve kid. There's like kid focused stuff that you have to drive them to, but there's not like places for adults hang out with their kids. That's not
Yes.
the exception here is that you can take kids to pubs, which is very different for me as a Canadian, where you never take a kid to a bar, right?
Right.
But here,
Yeah.
like, there's a few pubs with playgrounds in
Yeah.
them, so you can
Yeah.
watch your kids while you have a beer.
Exactly.
So I
Beer
think
gardens.
that's
Yeah.
kind of the British exception. So every country has its own kind of strange exception that feels surprising to everybody else. But yeah, overall, I would say like kids are out of sight. They're not part of society, and that's a shame.
Yeah. What consequences? I mean, and maybe this starts getting into you as a human being living in a very different culture, and every culture is different. But
Mhm.
what do you either from a scientific perspective or just a personal perspective, being a parent, but also knowing the people in these different places, you have a very unique perspective. Like, what do you think are the consequences? And is it I mean, I think a cartoonish view I might have, and I'm just thinking this out loud right now, is that maybe like Aka are the right and we're wrong. And maybe that's oversimplified. But just in terms of, what the kids are like, or the consequences for humans, because every generation grows up, right? Like you become an adult, and so every kid now will be an adult, and every adult was a kid. um
Right.
you what is tell I don't even know what the question is, because I don't even know what the question should be, because you have that perspective. So please, like, what do you think is important to share about that knowledge that you see? These are kids growing up in a very different place, very different
Mm,
responsibilities, very different ability to
right.
take risks, have
Yeah.
autonomy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think like again coming back to the thing that like every formal and informal education is adapted to this social and ecological environment that you grew up in, right? And so like we had my son in Denmark, and there they do something that I would never do, even though I come from an equally cold country, which is like let kids sleep in a stroller outside and
Hmm.
sometimes like out of sight.
Yeah.
Like you're just like, all right, that's something. But it's very adapted to that social environment and to that ecology, and the kids grow up fine. And what was really interesting for us is like, for me at least, so when the nurses visit you at home and they do the assessments after you have a baby, and like then they come again a few times, and at 9 months they do an assessment like, is your kid ready for preschool, like for nursery, kindergarten, for what do they call it in North America? Now I've gone fully
Yeah, I
British.
know. Yeah. You can say
Yeah,
the
now I
British
have
term, yeah.
French. Yeah,
So is it
for
is
like
it
child
daycare?
daycare.
Yeah,
Thank
because
you.
I had Kita in Germany. So yeah, no,
Yeah,
David can
exactly.
tell us. Yeah, yeah.
It's 10:30 p.m., guys. I'm doing my
Uh,
best.
No, thank you.
uh,
You-
how,
So that she comes through and she's like, can your kid wave? Right? The assessment, like, are they ready for daycare? Can they
Mm.
wave? Um, do they eat well? And then the last one is like, do they fall asleep in the stroller, in the like in the buggy, right? And that's
Right.
not a question that we would include in the UK on child development, right? That's a very culturally specific one. I loved for my kids, so the UK-wide assessments that they do, one of the assessments for social development was like, can they get dressed alone? Which is,
Mm.
of course, not so it's not about the social at all. It's about the individual autonomy, right? So again, these are all things that reflect the environment. And I think for the BaYaka that I work with, the way that they parent also reflects their environment. So from very, very early on, there's a lot of physical stimulus, right? Kids are held upright very early on. They're worn in side slings, so they have the full view of what's going on around them. And the moms, for the most part, take them into the forest. So they feel that rhythm of, it's hard to imagine like using a machete while you're carrying your baby. But if you think about the embodied lessons of that from the earliest age, right? We think about the evolution of our brains, but the kind of brain body connection, especially when you're using your body all the time, is really important too. So they're getting that input from very, very early on. Also, a lot of touch. So co-sleeping, on-demand breastfeeding. You just see these kids passed around everybody in camp. Um, so they're getting a lot of alloparental support and a lot of play and a lot of autonomy from an early age. So you'll often see kids as early as they can grasp with a dull knife just hacking away at something, doing the kind of object play that we see here with kids with blocks, right? Hit the block over and over again. Hey, that's great. That makes a noise. Doing it with knives. And, some people in the literature have called it laissez-faire parenting, where you kind of hands off, but actually it's not that at all. Everybody, right? If you think of like the average American living room, you've got 30 people living in that space. Everybody's very aware of what the kid is doing and whether or not they're safe. And I've definitely seen parents turn kids away or change out a knife for a dollar one so that they can't hurt themselves, move a kid away from a fire. And it's these really subtle
Mm.
interactions
Mm.
that are redirecting
And
kids.
and these are other parents that are moving the kid away from
Everybody.
or
Yeah,
everybody.
everybody's in teenage girls, teenage boys,
Interesting.
siblings, grandparents, just
Because
everybody.
usually it's a bit of a faux pas in Western culture if I
Yeah.
were to pick up someone else's child and move them out of
Yeah.
harm's way. I remember
Yeah.
well, my wife and I were at a restaurant and our daughter was like climbing this hill and like sliding down the hill and like treating this hill like a slide, and some random woman just like picked her up and thought that she was like falling, and it was great. It was like this monstrous violation of a
Yeah.
social norm that she would have the gall to pick
Yeah.
up our child,
Yeah.
and then she's like, apparently she's okay, is what she said.
Right.
And but the contrast between that and an environment where everyone has got an eye on everyone else's kid and it's totally fine if I go up and pick up someone else's kid and move them away, it's just a very different world.
For sure.
Uh,
And I mean, but I don't know what it was like in West Germany, David, other David,
yeah.
but in East Germany, people tell kids off in like public transit all the time for being too loud.
Oh yeah, no, 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 totally. Yes.
Yeah, and adults yell at other adults for
Yes.
violating norms because
Yes.
we were there during the pandemic and the rules were constantly changing about what type of mask you were allowed. And so if you just weren't up to date from a midnight change, you could get yelled at in a grocery store by another adult in German. And I don't speak German, so that was always
Yes.
tough. Like, I don't know why you're yelling at
Yes.
me.
No, exactly.
So I think the kind of rugged individualism of North America, North America, I'll throw Canada in there, is quite different where from these a little bit more collectivistic cultures where there's a lot more, and in the UK you would never do that too. But in Germany, you definitely would. And in Denmark, maybe a little bit as well.
So letting the kids play with a dull knife, that's sort of the opposite of helicopter parenting. And it's not random, like you said. To
Yeah.
what do you attribute why that is either in the minds of the people, like what is to be anthropological, sort of what's the emic or etic
Yeah.
explanation of that? What's going on in the minds of the people, and then what, from an ecological perspective, why is that sort of where everyone's at?
hmm So in terms of like what people say, um, for them, there's a high premium on childhood autonomy, but it's a very different type of autonomy that we think about, which is very individualistic. The autonomy that a lot of hunter-gatherers, including the community that I work with, practice is like cooperative autonomy. So the idea, everybody's doing their own thing, but you all kind of know that everything's going to benefit the group. And this is like a very classic thing that we see, like in the morning, everybody's like ping, 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 like off to their own activities. And you're like, even if you ask a husband, like, where's your wife? He's like, I don't know, she's out.
Mm.
But then at the end of the day, it's like all the food's being cooked, and then you have these kids running from hearth to hearth, sharing these plates of food and redistributing those resources, right? And
Mm.
if I don't have enough palm nuts, I'll come grab some for you from you. And if you don't have enough cassava leaves, I'll give you some, right? Like, so it's very kind of communal in that way, but with very strong norms. It's hard because you don't tell people what to do, but you can demand goods from them. So you can demand things, but you can't tell people what to do. And even inferring what people think, often I'll be like, why did that person go off into the forest, like trying to do behavioral observations in absence? And people will be like, I don't know, it's their own thing. Like even if they probably do know, you would never kind of verbalize why you think somebody is doing something if they've
Mm.
not expressed that themselves. So there are those norms. And I'll also say, like, the only time I've seen people tell each other what to do is when a parent was trying to tell their kid what to do or not to do. And that's when other parents intervene and like let them do their thing.
Mm.
And so there's this view that kids,
Wait. So parents were telling their kids what to do, and then other parents interjected
intervene.
on the child's behalf so that the
Yeah,
child could be
exactly.
left alone.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that is
That's the
fascinating.
only
If there's any
time I've
kids listening,
seen.
they're like, man, that sounds awesome. And
Yeah. So like what we see is like parents will be like, my kid knows what they need to learn right now. And even if my colleague Dasha Bomzhakova has done a lot more kind of cultural anthropology work, but people will talk about from a child develop like on child development. And from her work, we know that in the same community where I work, like the conception of child development is like a ripening fruit. You cannot speed up a fruit to ripen, right?
Hmm.
But you can curate the environment around it. So you can clear the ground, you can add nutrients, you could do the things that will help that ripen, but you can't be the one physically make it ripen, which is very different than plant metaphors in other places. Like in Japan, some of the plant metaphors are, a child is like a tree, you need to straighten it, right? So it's very much about the modification of the kid themselves. Whereas in what we see is not about modifying the kid, it's about modifying the environment around the kid to ensure that they learn. And so people doing things around a campfire is a way for kids to learn. We tried to do this experiment and it failed, and it took me years to understand that I failed the experiment, not that my like participants didn't understand. Like they understood exactly what they were telling me, and I was the one that didn't understand. So I was trying to show videos of things that we would call teaching and ask them, is this teaching? Yes or no, why or why not? And then I wanted to start the experiment by showing them clips of things that were, to me, definitely not teaching, like a mom like braiding her kid's hair. And everybody's like, yep, it's teaching. Yep, they're teaching. And then I just dropped the experiment because I was like, it's fatally flawed. I've done something horribly wrong. And then I realized, like, oh no, like for them, any act of being together is a form of teaching. Like it's just
Hmm.
that simple. Living together is sharing information.
Wow. Do you find that there is a concept of a bad parent or bad parenting in this culture that you work with? Because I know from personal experience with my own culture that that is a huge concept for us of judging each other based on how good of a parent we are, whether we're being irresponsible, whether we have the kids' best interests at heart, whether we're keeping them safe. You mentioned the story of people interjecting on the child's behalf. Often in Western cultures, it's actually the opposite, where people will interject because you're not keeping as you're not telling your child what to do. You're not keeping
Right.
them safe. You're not paying
Yeah.
enough attention to them. It's actually the opposite kind of interjection. So I'm curious if there is this kind of parental status competition, for lack of a better term, uh, in that community along the lines of, say, you're a bad mother because you don't breastfeed or whatever. Like these are a big part of the cultural conversation here, and you could have tremendous loss of status for being seen as a bad mother or a bad
Yeah.
parent. Is there similar kinds of status loss um, in the community you study? Do people
Yeah.
judge each other as a bad parent? Is there a different concept of a bad parent, or is that concept not even apply?
I mean, I have to say, like, there's, with one exception that I'll say in a sec, I haven't really seen people talk about bad parenting. I've seen people talk about good parenting, which is doing things with your kid, feeding your kid properly, taking them into the forest. But in terms of bad parenting, I've seen grandmothers be annoyed that their daughter went off to a forest camp with her husband and didn't come back for longer, kind of thing. But it's not really considered bad parenting. I think the one exception would be breaking taboos around diet during pregnancy, around sexual intercourse during pregnancy and postpartum, coming out of the lying in period too early, eating the wrong food. So I would say more taboo breaking, especially in terms of diet. Again, I wouldn't say it's bad parent, but that's how people would explain negative consequences to kids,
Hmm.
um, is in terms of those things. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, there are certainly lots of taboos around dieting and
Yeah, for sure.
pregnancy here as
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
which, makes evolutionary sense given the importance of fetal development and what you're eating at the time that the fetus is developing and the potential for, teratogens to screw with fetal development. So that makes a certain amount of evolutionary sense that diet and pregnancy would be a hot topic for taboos to arise.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I just find it so fascinating that um, among us, being seen as a good parent is such a huge part of our identities, and the fear of being a bad parent is such a huge driver of our behavior. But it seems like that fear isn't present to the same extent,
Yeah.
um, or at least it's restricted to, say, food taboos or sexual taboos, but it isn't quite as widespread as it is here.
Yeah, and I think part of that is like there's just this evening out effect of having loads of people take care of your kids.
Yeah.
Like in the village where I work, there's 700 people from two different like cultural communities, and everybody lives in quite close quarters. There's one house in the center of the village that I call the house of 1,000 people because it's pretty much as big as a little bigger than my living room. And there's a grandmother, a grandfather, like four adult couples. So that's like 8 people, and then all their kids that all live there. And like it's like a clown car when you see people come out in the morning, like just like more and more people coming out. And they just live in super tight quarters. And when people get annoyed with each other, they go off to a forest camp for a while and then they come back. Like, so you just have that freedom of movement too, which also makes sure that people don't get too much on each other's nerves.
But then this brings us to like, so like you mentioned, like there's a lot of L parenting. You're really seeing front lines, sort of the difference between parenting in a weird environment versus kind of more ecologically valid, quote unquote. Um, what's your sense of that? Is that something like, we're all parents to fairly young children right now. Do you have it in your own experience? Like, do you ever think like, oh, I wish my child was growing up in there, or is it just everything's different? And yeah.
There's so many trade-offs, right? So like when I was pregnant, I was like so romantic about it. I was like, I'm gonna take my infant to the Congo. It's gonna be awesome. And then I have a friend who's like works in medical anthropology and epidemiology, and he was like, that is so dangerous. There's like no hospital, there's no road in the village where you work. Like there are unsequenced mosquito-borne
Mm,
illnesses, right? And I think when I talk to a lot of people in the village about what they want for their future is like better medical care, and we have the luxury of that. So it's hard to say, like, what would I want more or less of, right? And this is like, I guess, a hot topic right now, but like, I think it's very easy to be anti-vaccine when you haven't seen kids die from those illnesses. And I've seen that in the villages where I work despite vaccination campaigns. So in that sense, I feel very grateful to have access to the medical care that I have access to. But at the same time, I do feel sad for my kid who will probably be an only child, um, that he doesn't, and his part of his family lives in the south of England, so 6 hours away. The other part lives in Canada, and he just doesn't get to grow up with like loads and loads of kids. So it's, David Lancy talks about like in most of the world, parents don't play with their kids, and it's easy not to play with your kids when there's 20 other kids in the neighborhood for them to play with. But if you're alone in a house, it's like, okay, then they're gonna what? Stare at a wall? Like, what are they gonna do? I've got to get on the floor and play. So there are obviously changes, but I think for me, it's not a question of like weird versus non-weird settings. There's a lot of diversity in how kids grow up. And it does, in some ways, calm my parent fear or my bad parent anxiety when I'm like, okay, if I just go out in the garden and like work on my garden, he can just come and do what I'm doing. And I don't always have to be doing what he's doing. Like sometimes it
mm,
can go in the other way. Or, sometimes he does something that feels like the slightest bit, I don't let him play with knives, but like slightest bit dangerous. I'm like, okay, just this is nothing and compare it and like just let him take that little bit more risk. That said, he is the most cautious child in the world, and that's my fault and my anxiety. So I don't think I've been super successful, but sometimes when I'm able to turn that part of my brain on, it's like, just take a step back, let him fall. He's gonna survive. So I think in that way, yeah, it has shaped me. Again, like I just wish there's more public places for kids to congregate, and
Yeah.
then you could just let them run around and just make sure they're still there kind of thing. I
Yeah.
think that would make a big change in child development generally and parenting well-being as well. I don't know how you guys feel about that too.
Yeah, I mean, it's been striking. I mean, again, it's nothing like Congo versus UK or Canada, but just even Berlin versus, Santa Barbara. I'm seeing like the adolescent kids like hanging out at like Target. And
Yeah,
in
right.
Berlin, it was like,
Yeah.
they're just like hanging out in like beautiful parks, and
Yeah.
it's just sort of, and it feels sad. I feel bad for the kids, and it's just like, I always think like if we were zoo animals, which is sort of a weird, it is kind of like an alien anthropological perspective, but like what would you put in there? Like you need like a common space like for people to just sort of like hang out and like
Yeah.
sit together. And it's weird how our planning, at least in the suburbs, and there's a whole history of sort of racism and
Yeah.
white flight and all kinds of reasons for why the planning is the way it is in car culture. But no, like Berlin, it felt like it would have been if I had to like stay in a 20 square kilometer or mile zoo pen, I would have
Yeah.
preferred Berlin to
Right.
to Santa Barbara,
Yeah.
weather notwithstanding. So
Yeah.
that's my experience too. I don't know for David.
Yeah, no, it's pretty similar. I remember when I was traveling, I visited Berlin, and I was all similarly struck by how well integrated the playgrounds were with the adult spaces, and I just hungered for something like that in the U.S., and there just isn't really anything like that. I remember there was this awesome public space with like bars and restaurants and a playground, and it was all just mixed together.
Yeah.
And man, I just wished that there was something like that here, and there just isn't. Um, yeah. So I have two Darwinian mysteries that are on my
Okay.
mind
Hit me.
about child development. I'm curious if you can help me solve them. It's okay if you don't have the solution,
Okay. I feel
but
it
here's
feels
my
like a test.
okay, we'll see if we can solve it together. Darwinian mystery number one. So food and sleep are two basic human needs, right?
Uh-huh.
And yet my 2-year-old daughter, she's about to be 3 in April. I cannot get her to eat and I cannot get her to sleep. You'd
Right.
think, from an evolutionary perspective, that she would be
Yeah.
thrilled to get fresh, ripe fruit, delicious food beyond the wildest dreams of her ancestors. It's
Right.
available for her, it's right there. She doesn't eat it. It's bedtime. She's clearly tired. She's rubbing her eyes and yawning and crabby, and she refuses to go to sleep. Why won't my kid eat and sleep?
Okay, so what does she eat? Because presumably she eats something.
Well, it's so random and capricious. Like things that she was into the previous day, she's totally not into the next day. And she'll take one bite and say, I want different food. And then she'll eat one bite of another thing and say, I want different food. And
Right.
then she'll just like get distracted by playing with some toy or like playing with her food. She's much more inclined on playing with her food than eating it, which is
Yeah.
frustrating because I need to get her to eat her food so that we can get her on a schedule and get her to preschool or get her to bed or whatever.
Yeah.
And so,
Okay, I think we
yeah.
found your I think we found your Darwinian problem. So
Okay.
like I think it has to do with schedule. So all of the
Okay.
like the kind of stress we put on ourselves and we put on our kids is just trying to get them to the next thing, which I am the same. I'm like, eat your goddamn porridge, we're gonna be late for school.
Yeah.
Um, so I think we're often training kids in our culture to be out of tune with their bodies and get
Mm,
into with these, and because we do the same, right?
mm,
Like kids are doing that in school too. Like, raise your hand if you need to use the toilet. How dare you get up and follow your bodily functions or open a banana in class, even though you're hungry? So I think a lot of it is that we're trying to get kids to eat when they're not really hungry,
Hmm.
kind of thing, and trying to fit into a schedule, which again is cultural learning, right? Like, you do in our society need to suppress and learn to control these different desires, so that you can function as a member of society. And unfortunately, at 2 and 3, that's it just is a little bit more time consuming to do that. But in terms of food preferences, like there's a lot of research, for example, by one of my PhD mentors, Alyssa Crittenden, that our brain really needs, our growing brain needs a lot of sugar to grow. And so kids have these huge cravings for fruit, for honey, for sweet things. And those are the things that she probably does like, is my guess. Like, does she like blueberries and raspberries and like Cheerios and that kind of ice cream, I'm assuming is a preference.
Yeah.
And it's all
Yeah,
to
totally.
feed like, yeah, all to feed a growing brain. So I don't have a solution because did all the like child-led weaning and we were feeding him loads of weird stuff. And now at 4.5, it's like pasta or cucumber or pizza and cucumber. What are you gonna eat tonight, dude? Like there's not a lot of diversity
Yeah.
there. I will
Yeah.
say though, like in the Congo, people eat the same thing every day, like different variations of the same thing. And I think we might have too much diversity in our diets. Like we're just like eating something different every single day. And like
Hmm.
there it's just like, are you having cassava leaves with caterpillars or are you having cassava leaves with antelope tonight? Like, so it's like a lot more kind of stable. And there's maybe seasonal variation that changes. So I have wondered if we're just trying to cram too much diversity and it's just like, here's the same nutritious food every single day, get on with it kind of thing.
So you think if I fed her the same thing every day,
I
she
don't
would
know.
be she
Do you want to do an unethical experiment?
run the experiment? All right, it's cassava leaves every day, whether you like it
Yeah,
or not.
that's
Poor,
right.
poor
Yeah.
David. I feel like this is like a therapy session for David. 2.5 year old. Yeah, my son's a little bit over 5. Yours is 4 and something. Yeah,
Four and a
it
half.
gets
Yeah.
easier, David, as they get older. Yeah, I think.
Okay, that's good to know. That's
I
good
think
to
there's
know.
also like an aspect of control. Like she is probably learning
Yes.
like how you're gonna parent her too. So as long as she can say no when you're like, okay, here's a different food, then she's like learning what you're willing to do for her, which is part of attachment, right? So it's a good thing,
Um,
even though it's tiring. And I would say the sleep thing too. I don't know, does she sleep with you guys or is she in her own room?
in her own room.
Yeah, a lot. It's really hard for kids in their own room. It's so funny because we co-slept and we plan to co-sleep. All anthropologists delude themselves that they're going to sleep really well because they're co-sleeping and kind of thing. And then we all at conferences talk about how tired we are that our kids still aren't sleeping through the night. And so our kid slept with us until we moved into this house, so until he was like 3.5. We finally started getting him into his own room, but we fall asleep with him in his bed, and then when he wakes up, he crawls into our bed. So is he really sleeping independently? That's debatable. But then I started talking to other people who sleep train, and some people are like, "Oh, like sleep training, that was so easy. Like my kids slept on their own." And then you meet them when they've had a second kid and they thought they were like really amazing parents who just had it all figured out. And it turns out they just had like a really easy kid. And then the second kid is like, we can't get her to sleep. She's in her night every night, like in her bed every night, touching me. Like, so I think it just has to do a lot with like diversity in kids. But I think most kids aren't comfortable sleeping alone. And then again, it's about making sure that the parents can sleep so that they can wake up well rested and get to work and do their work, right? And I think there was like even a Facebook, like a Zuckerberg thing where they were paying Facebook was paying for sleep consultants for their staff because they were like, when our employees get good night's sleep, they are better employees. So that was like one of the perks of working at Facebook. And like frankly, he's right. Like sleep deprivation is a really big issue for parents. So my guess is that that's probably what, but I couldn't tell you for sure. But co-sleeping seems to be a pretty universal thing in most parts of the world.
Got it. Okay, well that's a pretty good solution. I think I buy that for the
Yeah,
most part. All right, here's the
that's the
other.
food one.
You just need a really big bed. Get a
Yeah.
king
Yeah, no, I
bed
mean it makes
or
sense. Like, if she's sleeping by herself in the dark, she's like vulnerable to predators and attackers. Like, that's an unsafe situation for her to be in. It makes
Yeah.
sense that she wouldn't want to be in that situation. And yet, I don't want her to sleep with me because she moves around a lot in her sleep. And I've slept with her a few times, and I always get horrible sleep when that happens because
Yeah.
she pokes me and tickles me, or whatever during.
Yeah.
So it's not a good situation. So it's a genuine case of parent offspring conflict where she's better off if she's safer in the bed with me. I'm better off if I can better get a better night's sleep, and we just have incompatible preferences there.
Yeah.
Um, the food thing I think is still a little mysterious because like
Yeah.
if you're in a hunter-gatherer society, you don't know when your next meal is gonna be. Like wouldn't it be a good idea to eat the food when it's there and it's available? And
I haven't seen that much of people going hungry. Like, I mean,
okay,
sometimes you just like have some tubers or whatever, but people usually have enough food to share w
okay,
with me, for example. So I haven't seen as many cases of food insecurity, people really going hungry. Um, yeah,
okay.
so
So
I
maybe
don't
I'm
know
maybe I'm
why.
overestimating how horrible life as a hunter-gatherer must be.
It's
That
pretty
that actually,
awesome, I have
yeah,
to say.
okay,
Like, I mean, people eat enough that the kids will stay up till like 1 in the morning playing and partying, right? So you have to
okay,
have some kind of, but when you were talking about like parent offspring conflict, so what's really
yeah,
interesting to me about that is like parent offspring conflict can only ever be enacted in specific socioecologies, right? And so in the
yeah,
communities where I work, people wake up. We've done, like my colleague Lee Getler, and also David Sampson and I have done um, like actigraphy studies on sleeping. And people wake up in the night and they get less sleep than we think people need, and they're fine. Like
mm,
they're smarter, they're more capable, smarter than I am. And I've seen instances of the opposite where this kid was like to his mom, like, please, please, can we go to sleep? Like, I really want to go to sleep. And she's like, I'm still out. Like, I'm not taking you home yet. So,
wow. The parent is begging the kid. Sorry, the kid is begging the parent to sleep. That's
yeah,
crazy.
yeah. So
Oh
it just
man,
depends on, the context of the conflict, right? Your need is to
got
have a
it.
good sleep so you can get up and go to work. But in these
Yeah.
communities, your need might be to stay up and socialize and do the
Hmm.
kind of political hobnobbing that you have to do to make it in an egalitarian community. Egalitarianism is so stressful. Everybody thinks it's
Hmm.
like utopia, but it's a lot of work to maintain. It's like gossip and redistribution and leveling and like punishment and like all this stuff happening constantly all the time in all these micro and macro social interactions. So
Yeah.
it might be in your best interest to be there for those interactions. And then your kid, it's like 11 p.m. and they just want to go to sleep because they've had a long day kind of thing. So yeah.
Okay. Well, my confusion about the food and sleep thing has been considerably reduced. I think you did a great job
Thanks. I did
responding
my
to that
best.
one.
I don't really
Uh,
study either of those things, but
okay, I have my second mystery for you.
okay.
So my daughter often has extremely strongly held, seemingly arbitrary preferences. So, for
Uh-huh.
example, she feels very strongly that mama has to pour the milk and not Dada, even though it's the same damn milk. Or we're
Uh-huh.
eating at dinner and there's, a bowl of tortilla chips and we're all sharing the tortilla chips. And there's plenty of tortilla chips for all of us. And then randomly she has a meltdown because I took a bite of a chip and she was mad because she wanted that particular chip. It wasn't that she wanted chips in general, and she was worried that she wanted that chip.
Yeah.
And she thought that I should have known that she wanted that chip before I took a bite of it. Or this used to happen, I was trying to get her, all the bedtime routine, trying to get her to bed. She would have these arbitrary preferences around bedtime. Like she would insist that I would wear a yellow hat every time I'd put her to bed while I read her the bedtime story.
Adorable.
She wants me to wear the yellow hat. I don't care. I'll wear the yellow hat. Whatever. You
Yeah.
got to pick your battles as a parent. But why the yellow hat? What is it? Like why does she have these strongly and she'll have a meltdown if I say no. So
Yeah.
like why does she have these strongly held arbitrary preferences?
Oh God, that's a real stumper. Okay, let's like the cog turns. The cog's turn, the turn's cog. It's almost 11. Um, okay, so I have two further questions about
Hmm.
what could happen, and you tell me what you think feels like it rings true, okay? So the
Okay.
one kind of avenue would be, well, we're humans and we like rituals. And so
Hmm.
she's creating these everyday rituals to make sense of her world. And so that's just part of, and maybe the kind of relatedly, but the second avenue is like rituals help us gain control. And probably if she's 2 or 3, she doesn't probably have a lot of control over her everyday life, right? Like you're probably deciding maybe with her input what you're cooking, what you're doing, but ultimately she's not in charge. And so she's making these rituals to feel like she's in charge in these minor ways. How does that ring true? Does that sound like psychobabble bullshit to
No,
you?
I mean, I buy that as like approximate level
Yeah.
explanation that she
Mhm.
wants to have some control over my
Yeah.
behavior. It's
But
still a little puzzle. Yeah.
there's not, so it's true that in our culture, but we all live in different places. Maybe you also maybe both Davids live in California, but here in the UK or in Canada or in Denmark, it's true that kids have meltdowns, right? I haven't
Yeah.
seen that in many of the communities that I work in
Hmm.
as much
Wow.
because
No
kids
meltdowns.
have,
You've never witnessed a meltdown?
I've seen a couple meltdowns,
Uh-huh.
but nowhere like my kid has a meltdowns like 3, 4 times just at any time we're just trying to get to
Wow.
the house. But
Uh-huh.
like I haven't seen that frequency of meltdown. I've seen it when kids have been
Fascinating.
really tired.
Uh-huh.
I've seen meltdowns. I actually did. So let me tell you a little story. So this 2.5-year-old kid that I became very close to during my field work, and I'm also close with his mom. He had this meltdown, and I was like, he's tired because that's what we always say, right? Anytime there's a meltdown, we're like, the kid's tired. And she
Hmm.
was like, he's hungry.
Hmm.
And he fell asleep in my arms and while she was cooking the food, and then she was like, oh my God, I think I should wake him up and feed him. And I was like, oh my God, do you never wake them up? Like, what are you talking about? But like in her conception of like why kids have meltdowns is that like they're really hungry, so I better get food in him, right? And he'd
Wow.
eat. It wasn't like he just skipped dinner, right? So,
Hmm.
but so I've seen a couple meltdowns of very, very young kids. But for the most part, it's not a daily occurrence. And keep in mind, I'm living in camp with people and I'm doing my research, so I see them all the time.
Hmm.
So that's one thing. And then the other thing that I'll say is like when kids have a meltdown, parents are like just sweeping them up and then taking them on activities. Like this one
Hmm.
time, this mom took her kid who usually hung out in camp foraging with her and her husband. And I was doing this research where I was asking parents every day, like, why did you or did you not take your kid with you foraging? And she said, oh, my kid is like, there's a word that doesn't really have an equivalent, but when you hear it, it's like kiri kiri. So it's like all over the place, like kind of,
Hmm.
which is like a
Yeah.
great word, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And she was like,
Crazy
my kid is
times.
just
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, my kid was just like kiri kiri in camp, like making fights with people and freaking out. So we just went out foraging and like just like we just went out and like did something. And so there's a little less kind of tailoring to the crazy whims of the 2.5-year-old. But because they have a lot of autonomy over their everyday, they maybe also have fewer crazy whims. So I'm not sure your question is it. I don't think that. I think we found maybe approximal
Hmm.
solution to your question, but I'm not sure there's actually an ultimate question there because there's so much diversity. I don't think it's necessarily an evolutionary puzzle.
Interesting. I mean, so could it be that the reason why those kids aren't having so many meltdowns is because they have so much autonomy and ability to control what they do and when they do it. And the reason why we see more meltdowns in Western educated, industrialized, rich democratic societies is that they have so much less control, that everything is dictated for them, what they do, when they do it, where they do it. And they have meltdowns to try to get some of the autonomy that they are desperately
Yeah.
craving and not getting. And perhaps that explains the strongly held arbitrary preferences,
Mm.
which is that's another way to have the autonomy that she would otherwise be getting
Yeah.
in a hunter-gatherer society, but that she's not getting here.
And question, does she go to daycare? Does she go to yeah, no,
She's in
yeah,
preschool right now, yeah.
she's in preschool. Because
Yeah.
the other thing that comes to mind is like she's probably not having meltdowns at preschool. And like kids are so good at controlling themselves in the right
Mm.
scenarios that self-regulate like you get that self-regulation kind of fatigue and then you get home and you're like rah, like
Yeah.
freak out at your
Mm,
parents, right?
yeah.
Because one of the things that I have to shoehorn peer learning in, sorry guys. So like
That's great.
basically in a hunter-gatherer community, right? Like when you're about that age, like 2 or 3, as soon as you can walk, basically, you follow these other kids and you try to go with these other kids. And I've seen like what looked to me like babies like toddle off into the forest behind like 10-year-old kids who look after them and make sure they're okay. But when
Hmm.
you're around peers or when you're around, um, yeah, like kids your age or a little bit older than you kind of have to self-regulate. And they're probably, even if they're a little bit older than you too, they're probably helping you self-regulate. And I've definitely seen kids tell other kids like how to self-regulate either through play, like, oh, don't cry, like here, have this, or like tease them about having a meltdown in the rear case. Like if they hurt themselves and they cry for too long, they'll give them a hard time about it. And so they're kind of teaching each other these self-regulation skills. And also they're not having to control themselves for these like very intense period of time because they can go back and forth to their parents when their parents are in camp if they want to. So I wonder about that too, like maybe at school when she's playing with other kids and they're kind of engaging with each other in terms of the self-regulation behaviors and then holding it together all day. It's just so tiring for young kids. Again, very good skill set in a Western industrialized society to regulate your emotions in that way, and also for a small scale society, but just in different kind of distributions throughout the day.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I buy that. That's really fascinating. Just like how much domination there is of children in Western societies
Mm,
compared to what you see in hunter-gatherer societies. And
yeah.
like it's no wonder they're melting down all the time. Like I would melt down all the time if I was constantly being bossed around and told what to do by people who
Yeah.
are much bigger and stronger than me.
Yeah.
You know,
And
and I had
constantly
no
like yeah, there's this let me remember his name. There's this amazing book by this sociologist in the 80s called Life in a Classroom. So he
Mhm.
was this like very kind of test-takey type of psychologist who worked on school sociology. And then he met some primatologists and he was like, "Oh, I'm going to do some observations and see what life is like in the classroom." Jackson, his name is. And so he wrote this book, and it's like a great deep dive into the social life of classrooms because his point is basically like it's just self-regulation central. You never get to finish an activity that you want to finish, right? You're on the teacher schedule. You have to raise your hand to have basic bodily functions or ask questions. And one thing that he pointed out, which is really interesting, is like it's very rare for a teacher to tell you off for doing something wrong, but very common to be told off for breaking a classroom norm or rule, right? And like so you also have to control yourself in that way. So presumably schools are about transmitting specific bits of knowledge, but in practice is a lot more about specific norms, especially in terms of managing in classroom in that way. And so you're constantly having to switch on other people's schedules. And it's probably the case, like maybe she's not ready to go to bed when you tell her to go to bed. Maybe she just wants to finish playing. But then, like, I'm tired. I like when I put my kid to bed, it's because I'm tired and I need a break, not necessarily because he's always ready for it. So, and I need that schedule and I need that time to decompress. So, yeah, again, we're like butting up to a lot of those kind of post-industrial schedules, those pesky schedules. How dare they? There's
Yeah,
no schedule in a hunter-gatherer society.
right.
You follow your whims. Yeah.
Cursed by the schedule. Yeah.
The pure learning. You sort of were like, I'm sorry to bring that in, but please, what do you want to say about that?
So most of my research so I kind of like accidentally learned through, so when you ask people like, who do you learn skills from? People always say like my mom, my dad taught me these skills. But when you actually observe what kids are doing and who they're interacting with in these communities, like 75% of the teaching that they're getting and receiving is from other kids of varying ages, but it's happening, kind of horizontally within their age group. And that's really, and also in play. And so that's really opened up a series of questions that we're now pursuing with my lab and also with like my amazing collaborators to really understand how kids are learning from each other and what they're learning from each other and how it works and how it differs across culture. So I don't have many answers yet, unfortunately,
Mm.
because all the research is kind of active. But one thing that Dorsa Amir and I, who's now at Duke, have written about is that maybe what kids are doing and learning from each other isn't actually all that much about what adults think they should learn, but a lot more about kids doing their own thing, and that that might actually be part of an adaptive social structure where kids almost act like innovation incubators or startups, right? Like they're these little working things. All they have is free time to figure stuff out. They can work together. They have to adjust to each other's skill set. They have different bodies. So it's not the case that you can just shrink a spear, right? Their strength is different. Their like head, why do they all have such big heads? Like they're like, right, they're like
They're right
proportions
at
are
doorknob
different.
level too right now for both Gina and I, yeah, you and I, yeah, where they're just constantly hitting doorknobs.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. So all their proportions are different. So they need to kind of adjust the adult world to their benefit. And that involves a lot of innovative thinking. And so if we think about those innovations and what they might do, like they might not matter that much most of the time, but they might really matter when there's a change in the system. And then you need these innovations. You need a pool of innovations to draw from. And rather than starting from scratch, you can start from what the kids have created, basically. So that's where we're at in our thinking. It all feels like Disneyland still because you have a theory, you have an idea, and you haven't tested it, and then you like put it to data and it all falls apart, and you're like, oh, that was so stupid. Why did I think that? But we've read enough literature at this point that we are like confident that there's something there. It's just actually testing the adaptation aspect of it.
One question then is sort of, I mean, there's so much to do when you're a kid. One
Mm,
is coordinating because that cohort is going to be the cohort you'll need to coordinate as adults. So that's
mhm.
one thing that, you're doing now, and that's an investment in the future. Even if kids change, like maybe the small weak kid becomes the strongest kid, or maybe the kid who, whatever. Um, there's that part. But another part, then it sounds like, and you can tell me if this is wrong, um, but then there's just they're creating their own innovative ways to be socially, or even ways to use the environment, or tools, or artifacts, or of course linguistically, or
Mm.
social structures, or games, or just almost anything you can think of that could be created.
Yeah.
It's not that they're just sort of trying to be little adults. They're actually their own culture.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. I think like one like thought experiment, especially knowing your research, David, the David at the top of my
Dave,
screen.
one thing we've clarified is I'll go by Dave and David.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're both P's too, so I
I
can't
know
even.
David P.
It's
It's terrible. Yeah.
it's really bad.
Yeah. It's even PI. I'm looking at our names right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like one thing that we propose as a thought experiment in an early paper is basically like if you think of like a mobile small like a mobile hunter-gatherer community, right? So you have these communities that are pretty, you have a group of like 30 people, so maybe 10 of them or less will be kids. And those kids will range from like 0 to adulthood, right? So they're a big age range. There's not a lot of room for competitive games. Like, how do you play a game of soccer, like the 3-year-old versus the 17-year-old, right? It's really hard. So what we often find in these small scale hunter-gatherer communities is that a lot of the games are a lot more like a test of your own skill, and they're very cooperative. Like one of the
Mm.
things the kids in the camp got into doing at one point. It was like they would tie this string around all of them and they would run around the camp trying not to break the string, which is like, if that's not a cooperative game, like I don't know what is.
Fantastic.
Um, but what happens when you settle in a bigger setting, so even before a transition to agriculture in the past, you would have had fishing communities that could settle in bigger communities. And all of a sudden, you have lot more kids and you might be able to play competitive games. So it's possible that shifts from egalitarian to non-egalitarian social structures could start, for example,
Mm.
with kids playing and bringing up those norms that they develop in their play with their peers into adulthood. And it would only take a few generations before that becomes the main ethos, right? Like,
Mm.
um, so like what kids are doing is pretty interesting. And I mean, even a more modern example, I was reading a book about the baby boom and how all these kids that did you guys know that the family meeting comes from like an anti-Soviet kind of like we're a democratic country, we were democratic families. Like that's what the idea of a family meeting is, like we make a decision together.
So wait, the concept of a family meeting was an
Yeah.
act of rebellion against the Soviet Union. That's how it started out. That's where this concept
Oh,
came
yeah,
from.
we're like an anti kind of like we're American, we're democratic in our state and we're democratic at home kind of thing. So that yeah, so
Interesting.
that's how
That's
it started.
hilarious. Yeah.
Isn't that hilarious? So
Mm.
so these kids grow up, all of them in these suburbs, right, with loads of same age kids to the point where for a while there were no teenagers in the suburbs.
Mm.
And then they're also getting these like super democratic values hammered into them at school, hammered into them at home, loads of space to play. And then finally they come up and get to university and they're like, Vietnam War? That doesn't sound right. Like anti-women attitudes, that's not right either. And so, and then all of them come of age at the same time and lead to this huge groundswell in culture change throughout, the world, basically.
Mm.
So we see these themes of like kids coming up and in under the right conditions, bringing norms that were instilled in them or that they developed on their own into their adult lives and leading to kind of bigger changes in culture.
So is the argument then that the parents of the 50s worked very hard to instill egalitarian and democratic values into their children, values that they themselves did not actually hold, that they were just paying lip service to as a kind of political signal
I think
of
so.
loyalty to the United States or something like that. But
Yeah,
because of all this lip service, they accidentally instilled those values into their children, and then when they come of age, they stay true to those values and use them to advocate for social change. Is that the basic idea that you're proposing?
that's the argument of the book that I read.
Okay,
Mm.
interesting.
And it felt true to me. It
Yeah, it's
felt
interesting.
from what we know from studies around demographic change in communities, and how that, or at least modeling studies about how demographic change can lead to, the spread of norms that didn't maybe weren't so popular before. And I think it would make sense that that's what we would see. And I wouldn't even say it's like parents them like definitely didn't hold true to those values, but the society of the structure, structure of the society didn't hold true to those structures, which of course we know because of segregation. The suburbs were key to
Hmm.
kind of segregationist city planning. Um, so all of a sudden, those structures, which are both doing and undoing, right?
Yeah.
Those types of inequalities.
It's really interesting because, you think about the claim, it's sort of outside the bounds of psychology because as a researcher, you can't be 200 or 300 years old to,
Mm,
as an adult scientist, look at what a group of kids are growing up in and then see what they look like as adults and then maybe
mm,
how they're raising their kids. I mean, this is where sort of history has to come in. What a
yeah.
hard thing to study. Um, but it's really interesting because I had sort of naively sort of I think one has a naive thought. I will say I have a naive thought that sort of, kids they're defenseless. They need to be taken care of, and a lot of times the social structure doesn't, especially in the U.S. or the U.K. It's like we were talking about earlier. It's not respecting them in the way that
Mm,
I would prefer, for example. Um, but at the same time, they're very powerful in the sense of they will be in charge, at least collectively, right? In
mhm.
the future. And I think it's easy to forget that because most adults don't see that. And if they do, they're just thinking about their kids as adults. And by the time they see it, they're so old. But that's a very different way to think about kids and why we should care about them is
Yeah.
because they will actually be in charge, even if we're not around to see the consequences.
Yeah, I don't know if you got like this will sound like a pivot, but have you guys watched Adolescence on Netflix yet?
Mm.
I
Uh,
have not. We started, but we haven't gotten around to finishing
yeah.
it. So I'm no spoilers, please.
Yeah,
But
I
I'm
won't
looking forward to
spoil.
actually
We're
watching it.
not done either, but like we're like, okay, we're gonna talk to Emmett about the manosphere like now. He's 4.5, but he needs to
Mm.
know this. Like, like we want to talk to him now about the stuff that's gonna come up as a teenager because I don't know, those conversations, you can't just kind of like they need to be practiced, right? Like Jerome Lewis, who's a social anthropologist who's been working with the same community as me, but like for many, many, many more years. He talks about this system of norms, and it's like a religious system that the BaYaka have. But the way that kids learn it is not like, okay, let's sit down and let me run you through the list. They like hear these food taboos. They see people acting a certain way or not a certain way before they go hunting. They overhear certain people can go hunting or not. Why? Because of Aquila. It's always this word Aquila. And then they start, as they grow older, start to make sense of all this stuff. So it's not like this kind of like cut. Okay, now you're a teenager. Now we talk about like blood, right? It's like very much a gradual thing that you're always exposed to. And I think that's like kind of where I'm at with all this scary Andrew Tate stuff, where I'm like, we start talking about it now. We're like, we start talking about consent now. We start talking about this stuff now, even amongst ourselves, so that those conversations are happening so that it's not like, and all of a sudden we pivot. Now you're 13 and we talk about this stuff, right? It's like always been part of your life.
Is that this? So the idea that is that you don't protect your kids from things that feel like they're too young for, or is that too strong of a way of putting it?
Yeah,
For
I think
example,
it,
like
yeah,
one example would be something like death. Like there's a
yeah,
philosophy that says, oh no, 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 grandma is went to go be
it
with,
happened.
yeah, or
Yeah,
something, as opposed to, oh no, no, she's dead, and like what's happening to her, she's decomposing. Like what
yeah,
is your
right.
thought on that continuum from like she's playing golf with grandpa, or there's worms eating her. What's the what's your take given your experience?
It's a good question. I mean, kids see death all the time there.
Yeah.
Barry Hewlett estimates that by the time an Aka kid is 18, 50% of the people they'll have known will have died, right?
um,
So they're experiencing death all the time. It's very traumatic for them. Bonnie Hewlett's work on this shows that they remember people who have died for a long time and they miss them. They see death of animals all the time because obviously they hunt a
mm,
lot. So death is just part of living there. Um, so definitely in terms of death, like we've had a lot of conversations about like where meat comes from. We went to this like farm shop butcher and they had like a goat like that they were carving up and we were like, okay, look at the bones, like that's food that we eat. Like just know that.
yeah,
Sometimes kids then like get really weird about that stuff where they like want to see loads of death and then you need to have a conversation about that too. Like, no, it's not something that like we want to happen, like
right.
just so we can see it kind of thing. But I can't tell you from a scientific point of view for sure either way, but I think it's probably always good to be honest with kids, but not so honest that you just scare the life out of them
Right.
too. And
Right.
I think that's the Aquila thing. Like they're not a lot of the knowledge that happens in this system of taboos, um, a lot of it is initiated when kids are a little bit older, but that doesn't mean it's not being talked about. It doesn't mean they're not exposed to those things in their everyday also. So more specialized knowledge, more kind of more ritualized knowledge, you probably would wait until their adolescence, but you lay the groundwork earlier. So it's less of a kind of cut, okay, now we're in this new thing, and more of a gradual joining in. So we come back to the joining in of what the community does.
Is there anything like as
I
like
mean,
oh, sorry, David, go ahead.
so do they have a kind of afterlife story that they tell kids or that they believe in themselves? Or do they say when something's dead and it's gone and its body is no longer working? What,
Yeah.
how do they conceptualize this?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different conceptions. So, people tend to have a shorter mourning period for when kids die because kids are reincarnated and come back in the same gender body, actually. And then, so souls are gendered amongst the BaYaka. And
Interesting.
then older people tend not to come back. Um, People who are
Hmm.
very kind of selfish come back as gorillas because gorillas think they're owners of the forest.
Uh-huh.
And also, BaYaka say that when they die, they come back as these kind of white people, which has meant with colonialism that some of their farmer neighbors say, well, the BaYaka say that they come back as like European people. Like, is that true? To which I say, I don't know what happens when you die, guys. Like, I don't
Yeah.
have those types of insight. So, very kind of diverse beliefs around death. And a lot of people, I mean, BaYaka are very forthcoming. I'll be like, what happens when you die? And they'll be like, I don't know, haven't been dead yet. Like they're, and then some people will have kind of deeper, maybe even be initiated into knowledge that's deeper around what happens around that.
Interesting. Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to know
Yeah, yeah,
what the
for
story
sure.
was there.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, I interrupted you, Dave.
I was just going to ask, the peer learning thing. I remember as a kid loving to hang out with older kids, and we get a chance
Yeah.
to do that after school. Um, it's a weird institution, maybe, or maybe not. You're saying what you're saying about like fishing, where there is a reason. I mean, the logic of stratifying kids by age makes sense from the perspective of you're roughly standardizing like what they can do. And so it makes
Mhm.
sense to do that.
Yeah.
But then the consequences of that, there may be externalities or byproducts that are unintended. Do you think that that's a weird, not in like the acronym sense, but just sort of like, is that a really strange artificial thing for our development to really just be around uh, really same age mates
Yeah.
and not be essentially alloparented or alloparent as kids?
Yeah, so I think a few things. I think it is strange how much time kids are spending in single age classrooms. I think it would be awesome for them to have more opportunities for multi-age learning. Also, just in terms of empathy development, like
Mm,
older kids being able to hang out with younger kids is really important for their development of like just being nice people, right?
mm,
Um, I also think that we often maybe not over focus, but we focus a little bit more on school and forget that kids tend to have a more diverse friend group in their neighborhood. So we've got like kids, a few households with kids on our street, and like some weekends they're just like going house to house, which is cool. And it's like from 3 to 8, I think they are. And there's just, five of them, but
yeah,
they have a great time.
yeah,
And we know from, research even going back to the 80s that the neighborhood friend group tends to be a little bit more autonomous and a little bit more diverse. Then again, very kind of Stranger Things child autonomy, which I think we are losing a little bit that pesky schedule. We come back to that. But then the other thing I'll say is like in some pastoralist communities, the whole community is structured around age sex that you're initiated with and to. And in some communities, the age sect even goes off and makes their own village, and then
mm,
women marry in. So in some communities, age is really the foundational structure of the entire community. Um, but again, it just varies so much in terms of how it's structured and to what degree. I think those age sects aren't like just 1 year slices, though. I think it's like a few,
right,
like maybe 3 or 4 years, um, but still quite stratified by age. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But David and I had talked previously about field work and sort of David, for example, it sounded he had this anecdote of talking to Dan Fessler at UCLA about, this whole field work thing. Do I actually have to do it? Um, it's really badass that you do field work. Um, for you, like as a person, because we don't do field work, um, what is your experience of like going back and forth to the field? Like, how do you feel like,
Mm.
and now that you're, you started doing this or, years ago, and I know people who keep going to the field, some people who don't keep going to the field once they have kids. Sort of like,
Mhm.
how do you think about the field and your own relationship to it, and like how it's changed you? Because we certainly, the people listening, most people probably don't know what that's like. And
Yeah.
certainly David and I, we've done things, but not that. So I'm just curious, like what you think about that.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I won't be like super like heroic and say that my first field season wasn't hard. Like I was so scared, first of all, when we got to this village and like all these people and I didn't know and everybody was coming to talk to me. I didn't understand a word that they were saying. Um,
And this is the
I was
Congo Basin.
there,
I mean, this is the Congo
yeah,
Basin, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, in the Congo, but yeah, I was in Republic of the Congo in the north. So it's a village that's quite remote. So you fly to Brazzaville, you take a very long bus journey to the capital of the north. Then you continue over a river, a very long car ride along some logging roads to then get to a boat. And then on the motorboat, you can make it in 4 hours to the village where I work. So there's no road. And so we get there and we're like unloading our stuff. I have no idea where we are. I've never been there before. I'm French is my mother tongue, but nobody there speaks French. French is also the national language of Congo. And I get pulled into this group of women who make me sit with them, and now all of a sudden, like, and like the BaYaka are they sit very close to each other, so all of these people are like entangled with me, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna die here.
Yeah.
And like I got stuck in pretty quickly. I'm lucky that in my undergrad I'd taken some Swahili courses and BaYaka is also a Bantu language, so all the words are different, but I knew how the grammar worked, and so I was able to slot in and was able to develop also with the help of another researcher who was there my language skills pretty quickly. But then all of a sudden I was like alone also at first I was gonna go work in forest camps. I'm in the village and I'm like, who's in the forest, guys? And they're like, nobody lives in the forest. And I'm like, all right. Well, there goes like my PhD plans. And all of a sudden, like as I started to know everybody's names, I start hearing names that aren't part of the set that I know. So I'm like, well, who's this person? And they're like, oh, well, he lives in the forest. I'm like, well, you told me nobody lives in the forest. And they're like, nobody lives in the forest, but he lives in the forest. And all of a
Mm,
sudden, this like mental map of all these kin who are like, some were like 2, 3 days. There's one guy who he's old, who lives in the forest full time with his wife. He never comes to the village ever. Like, so there's ecology people that like, because, they're far away, they just don't think of them. And I was like, okay, well, can you take me to this camp? So I get to this camp. I get along super well with the host dad. Well, the host camp. Now I call him my host dad. And I stayed there for 4 months and it was awesome, except it turns out you can't just bring like rice and beans in mesh bags into the rainforest and they're just going to be fine. So all my stuff went moldy. All my food went
mm.
more moldy. All my underwear went moldy. Like everything you can imagine went moldy. And so I like wasn't going to eat moldy rice and beans. So I got really, really thin. And the camp was breaking up to move further into the forest. And I just didn't quite feel well enough. So I was just like, I think I'm going to go home. So I ended up going home a month early than
Wow.
planned. And I think it's important to tell those stories because like but then like the more I went, the more I got used to food, the better my language skills went, the closer friendships I made. Now it really feels like I'm going home. Like it's like my other home. I One thing I find really hard about being away from the field is that a few of my friends have passed away in between. And I'm not there for their funerals. I always send a bit of money to contribute to the party, but to the funeral ceremony, but I'm not there for those things, so that's always a little bit difficult. Um, but at the same time, I always get news when people come to the bigger towns where there's cell phone reception, which is really nice. And yeah, it feels like our lives are intertwined. Do you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so it's nice to have that feeling of I have a home away from home, and I hope that they feel as taken care of as I do by them. That's like the
Mm.
main thing. Yeah.
That's nice. So the world sort of the cost of entry being that difficult, you sort of get a second home or the world shrinks a bit.
Yeah, think so. Think so. And sometimes you might not like get along with people, and that's okay too. If not everybody's made for field work, and that's all right. You can
I'm not
make
made for
very
field
I
work.
can see
you're not
David's
made for
face
field work.
during the
Yeah.
moldy beans and rice.
Nope,
I'm just
nope,
see
nope, nope, nope,
I'm
nope, nope.
I'm just David. David is like, man, I don't like if they get my order wrong at a restaurant. That's
Yeah. I'm kvetching if I'm, a few degrees below the optimal temperature or above.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, but it's like,
you
like
call
my
this
daughter,
well done. You call this
I have
well
lots
done.
of
Yeah.
strongly held arbitrary preferences like my daughter. So,
okay, so it sounds like an inherited trait.
yeah, maybe that's the solution
Socially
to the mystery.
inherited trait.
Yeah. Sheena, is there anything we should have asked you?
I don't know. Is there
Or should
anything you
ask
should have
you?
asked me? You guys tell me. Is there anything
Um,
else you want to know?
Um, I think we covered a lot. It was pretty cool, wide-ranging discussion.
yeah, and I really I feel like what I love about anthropology is it is a window into like our world, and it's such a privileged thing to talk to you and to people who do it. And I hope, like, I mean this, it sounds cheesy, but I mean this like sincerely. Like, I think it's a really special time and place to
Hmm.
be a scientist who's sort of, you're doing science, but you're also talking to people who ordinarily wouldn't be like part of the conversation. Like, we are talking, we're both in, David and I are in California, you're in the UK,
Hmm.
but we're talking about these stories from the Congo Basin, and that's because of you, right? And like your life doing that. And I think that's such a every time I talk to an anthropologist, I just like want to express appreciation of like that the fact that you do that is what allows all of us to like understand ourselves better, because like we're all people, right? And but to see that part of humanity expressed in that way is like really rewarding, and thank you for bringing that to us, um, in dealing with all the hardships that you dealt with to bring that.
I mean,
Thanks. Yeah.
given those hardships, we have a social norm here where we say thank you for your service to military personnel.
My God, I no, don't think
Which
you.
can I thank you for your service?
No. I mean, like honestly, like I think a lot of the all of the kudos go to these communities because they don't
Yeah,
have to welcome us in, right?
right.
We are such a burden on these
Mm,
communities. We make such a mess. We're so bad at everything. They have to take care of us. Um, and the fact that they're willing to share their lives with us, they're the real heroes
yeah.
because like there's a story of a group of hunter-gatherers who didn't like an anthropologist and they just got up in the middle of the night and moved camp. So I'm just always and left them alone in the bush. I'm just forever grateful that they haven't just
Yeah.
abandoned me in the bush alone.
So you're just waking up every morning like, okay, okay,
They're still
they're
here.
still
Yeah.
here. That's today will be okay. Everybody's
Yeah.
still here. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, thank you,
Thanks for
BaYaka.
having me,
Then,
guys.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you so much. Thank you, BaYaka. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, BaYaka.
Yes.
That's the right
Thank you,
move.
Baya.
Yeah.
We've reached the end of another episode of Evolutionary Psychology, the podcast. David, how can people help us out if they'd like?
Well, you can leave us a kind review. You can say something nice about us on social media. You can visit our Patreon page and give us a bit of money to support us. Uh, or you can stay tuned for the next episode, which should be coming out next week.
Yeah. And David, I'll see you between now and then.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.